Our final panel this afternoon I'm really excited about. It's sort of interesting because Monica was talking earlier about how humans are being treated like machines in business, and actually our last panel is in some ways, how do we turn machines into people? And this is actually an incredible process now, and has really come to the forefront because of the convergence of technology and computers, machine learning. And the question ultimately is it possible to imbue a robot or a machine with the components that are necessary to, at its highest level, be of service and not destroy mankind? Is this possible? We have some people like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking who have expressed great anxiety about this. And so this afternoon we brought this distinguished panel together. You've met briefly Sir Tim O'Shea, the principal or president of Edinburgh University. But I just want to mention our other panelists, the Reverend Professor Jane Shaw, who is the Dean of Religious Life here at Stanford and has a distinguished career, and is also from the continent in Oxford, although she did her master's in divinity, I think, at Harvard, and her PhD at some university, what's it called? Berkeley. And we have Alastair Boyle, who, while he works for a company called Essence and is head of strategy and client partner relationships globally, the reason he's here actually is from his background as a philosophy major at University of College London, and he's going to imbue us maybe with some ideas about moral philosophy. And then finally, Jon Oberlander. How many knew or know what epistemics is? Yes! Okay.
You need to raise your hands, Jon.
I had no clue. But he is a professor of epistemics, and in some ways this interfaces with informatics, computers, language, communication. And so this group of panelists is going to explore with us this concept of, is it possible to have a compassionate robot? Is this concept a myth? Will it be a nightmare? Or will it ultimately be a solution to the ills of humanity? So without further ado, I'd like to present Sir Tim O'Shea. Thank you again.
So pleasure to be here. I'm the most geeky speaker you've got. I'm a machine learner. And I was a little bit anxious that my job here was to be the fall guy, the klutz, the sort of mechanically minded klutz, and then everybody's more sophisticated than me. But I was actually relieved because Anna Brigitte Pessi, who's obviously much more sophisticated than me, mentioned in a positive way the Aibo, the Sonny robot dog, and about being alongside it. And so I will start with a confession. I have a robot dog in my office. That's not the confession. I have a robot dog in my office, but sometimes if I'm working at some weird hour where the other people aren't about and I've got spreadsheets or whatever, I have the dog walk around. And it walks around and it bumps into things and it kicks its ball and it waves its bone at me and wags its tail, and I find that comforting. And she used Brigitte. The dog is alongside me, and it is obviously saying, that poor university president trying to make the budget work. So I'm fairly clear you can get compassionate robot dogs. So in my little spiel, the argument that I will make is clearly we're going to have an issue with the word compassion. Compassion relates to shared suffering. And you can clearly, as you can with the word intelligence, get into some very elaborate debates. So I'm going to cheat a bit and not answer the exam question. So I'm not going to talk about compassion. I'm going to talk about artificial compassion. We talk about artificial intelligence. We're relaxed about talking about it. We talk about my own area. When I started working in machine learning 45 years ago, people would say that is a ridiculous idea. Nowadays, they don't say machine learning is a ridiculous idea. So I'm going to make the assertion, with a little bit of argument, that I certainly find the idea of artificial compassion perfectly reasonable and perfectly plausible. If we go back to the machine learning example, on this campus in 1959, a guy called Arthur Samuel did something very important in the history of artificial intelligence. He produced a computer program which learnt to play checkers better. It didn't just play checkers, but it learnt to play checkers better. And as a consequence of playing more and more games, it got to, this computer program in 1959 got to a situation where it behaved like a fairly skilled checkers player and could certainly beat probably most of you in this room, certainly could beat me. And then artificial intelligence applied itself to chess. We all knew chess would be very difficult. And in 1997, Kasparov was beaten by Blue Gene, an IBM machine, a machine that did not do an exhaustive search, a machine that had learning components to it, did some quite statistical stuff. And then, as we've heard, some of my thunder was stolen. If you had asked me 5 years ago, could a computer program beat a Go master, I would have said no. No chance. Go is too complicated. For those of you who don't know it, it's played on by 19 boards, so 361 positions. You start by placing a single stone, so your opponent has 360 different places to place their stone back. If you can argue about how many possible Go games there are, playable. The answer is something of the order of at least 10 to the 700. So if you take the fastest supercomputer we know, and you have it going like the clappers, it will still not be able to try out every possible Go move in a game before the end of the world, to the sense that we know where the end of the world might be. So Go is a game where the combinatorics are horrific, and yet using an approach to machine learning. See, now we're comfortable. If you say machine learning, nobody argues with you. You know, does Samuel's program, is it doing some form of learning? Yes. Human learning? No, it's not human learning, it's machine learning. The Go program that won 3 games in a row against the European Go champion, is it learning? It is definitely learning. The reason it got to this very high state of ability is by playing tens of thousands of games against versions of itself. In fact, that program ran on 32 computers, and basically you think of that as 16 pairs of computers playing Go against each other, but then all clubbing together to say, using statistical methods and using meta descriptions. So we can be very comfortable that machine learning or artificial learning is a real concept. If we come to robots, if you go to Japan, I encourage you to go to Osaka, where Hiroshi Ishigaru has got the most humanoid robots in the world. If you go look at them, they are quite extraordinary. The skin, the eyes, the eyebrows, these look like people. Even close up, they look like people, they talk like people, but they make people very uneasy. And another very distinguished Japanese roboticist, Mashiro Mori, came up with the term uncanny valley. And what he argued, and this is a notion that has been adopted by most roboticists, is if a robot looks too much like a human, and Ishiguro's ones really do, they really do look like humans, then they make you very uneasy because they look like dead humans, because you know there's something wrong with them. There is just something about the way the eyes work, the way the winking works, something about the way the breathing is going. You know it's not a real person. Maybe it's a zombie, maybe it's a dead. So what people have done in robotics is they have quite deliberately made robots that take advantage of the things that we have. 2 feet, quite handy. 2 ears for stereo vision is good. two eyes for stereo vision, 2 ears for stereo listening is good. So they've taken those, but then they have quite deliberately introduced something so that when you look at it, you could say, oh, but this is not a human. This is not a robot pretending to be a human. This is a robot. And the robot that is worth thinking about is called Pepper. Interesting short name. It's not a Japanese robot. It's a French robot from a firm called Aldebaran. It looks sort of humanoid. It's got a head, it's got arms, but then it's got something which is very unhumanoid. It's got a screen on its chest. And the screen on its chest tells you what it's thinking or what it's remembering. So you're very clear. But this robot has, for the first instance, it's been deployed in Japan. It's been deployed in a chain of mobile phone shops by a company called SoftBank Mobile. And what this robot can do is it can do really good facial recognition. It can look at your eyes. You don't need to be crying. If you're a bit sad, it can look at your eyes and see you're a bit sad. It can look at your mouth. You don't need to be shouting angrily. It can tell the difference between an angry pucker and a slight grin. And it can listen to your voice and tell the difference between, is this a very agitated person or is this a calm person? And not only can it do these things, but through contact with individuals, it can learn to be better at recognizing whether you're happy, whether you're sad. And the notion is, you go along, you meet one of these robots, it looks at you, it says something, maybe it's a happy thing. You see the robot again, you're a bit gloomy. What does the robot do? Well, the robot does two things. First of all, it puts its head on one side and looks sad, because it can demonstrate artificial empathy. If you're looking happy, it goes, hee. If you're looking sad, it goes, mm. And then, while looking a bit sad, it plays you in a space between its belly and its chest, an image, because while it's chatting to you before, it was also recording you, it shows you the happy scene. And it's basically saying, remember the last time you came into a mobile phone shop? You were happy. And maybe that will make you happy. Now, is that human compassion? Obviously not. It's not any form of shared suffering. And there's one, Murray, who writes very interestingly about Buddhism and robots, said it would be a terrible thing to make a robot genuinely compassionate, because that would mean that you would have to, on purpose, design a machine that could suffer. And it would be a bad thing to deliberately design. So Murray, who I would encourage you to read, says that clearly you wouldn't want to make a robot that was genuinely compassionate, because without suffering there can be no compassion. But there is also no question in my mind that a robot that recognizes you as you, that recognizes from your face and from your voice, are you happy today or are you sad today? And that can refer to past experiences which you have shared with that robot. That would certainly give you the basis for some artificial compassion. And then one could imagine, for example, one of these placed in a hospital setting where it comes by your hospital bed every day, where you say goodbye to it as you go in to do an operation, and as you come out of the operation, it says to you, how did that go? Well, that might not be real compassion, but I will assert that artificial intelligence is a realistic concept. So that's the geek's point of view. Thank you very much.
They're just going to pull up an image with which I'm going to begin, but let me say that my knowledge of artificial intelligence is deeply low, and so therefore I'm a bit of a fraud on this panel. So I'm really interested in the ways in which we can or cannot teach compassion and empathy. And one of the things I do here at Stanford, I'm a professor of religious studies, is teach a course to first years on empathy, which is multidisciplinary. And it's in a series of classes of which first year students have to take one called Thinking Matters. And they all have big words as their titles, like war, love, belief, empathy. And it's helpful because it's an interdisciplinary course, so they learn something about how you think in a whole range of disciplines, from drama to poetry to neuroscience to artificial intelligence, which is the last week of the course. So this has nothing to do with what I'm going to say now, this slide, but I wanted to say, particularly for those of you who are visitors from Edinburgh and other parts, welcome. And we have this extraordinary building on campus, which I hope you can see while you're here. It's called the Windhover or Windover Contemplative Centre, and it was opened only a year and a half ago. It has these beautiful paintings of kestrels by Nathan Olivero. I just want to say it's the only device-free space in Silicon Valley. And it is it's run out of the Office for Religious Life, my office, and it's deliberately designed to be a quiet space for individual contemplation and meditation, and we run meditation classes so that students and staff and faculty can learn how to do that. So you have to have a swipe card, an ID card to get in, but those of you who are visiting, we would be delighted to show it to you. I showed John when he visited earlier this year, so just grab one of us who's a Stanford person and say, take me to Windover, and we will take you, because it's very beautiful. So my question in this brief presentation is, what does it mean to be human? In the biggest sense, what does it mean to be human and therefore compassionate or empathic? And what, therefore, is it that we would have to teach or program into a robot in order to enable them to have a relationship to human beings? So when I teach the empathy course, there is a hinge text halfway through. And the hinge text is Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments from 1757, a piece of moral philosophy, which argues that human beings are naturally sympathetic. Sympathy is the word he uses, and they have fellow feeling. And the whole book begins with saying that if you see a man on the rack, a man being tortured, you will feel that pain yourself. So there's a sense of compassion. But the book is also suggesting that you also feel joy. You laugh along with others when they laugh. You feel pleasure when they feel pleasure. And around about the same time that Adam Smith wrote this book, and indeed The Wealth of Nations, the novel rose. And there is a way in which you can think about the novel as a humanitarian narrative. All right? If you think about Charles Dickens, he is deliberately attempting to elicit your compassion or your empathy for kids in workhouses or poorhouses, right? I mean, that's part of what the novel is about. It's designed to elicit our emotional response to other characters. In other words, it enables us to have the experience of another human being without having to encounter that human being directly. So here's this moment in the Enlightenment, the 18th century, when Adam Smith is saying, look, something about how we relate to and show concern for other human beings is absolutely instinctive to us. It's about who we are. It's about part of our nature. That is sympathy. We might want to call it compassion or empathy. And here also, at the same time, is the rise of an art form which says you can cultivate your compassion, your sympathy, by reading these stories of people you might not otherwise ever encounter. So, and ever since then, one may like to say that the sciences and the arts have been, in a way, debating through numerous means how it is that we become, as human beings, compassionate. Prior to that, one may like to argue, I'm making a very big historical sweep argument here, which you can counter, that in the West, Christianity had largely assumed that ethics or morals, love, to use the Christian term, that would be the compassion is the Buddhist term. Love, I think, is a Christian term. Love needs to be taught, and that happens through parables and through commandments. It's taught, right? And you could have a real question about whether you can command someone to love. That, I think, is a genuine ethical question. So how do I make the next picture come on? Sorry. Oh, do I have a clicker? Thank you. Sorry. I'm so sorry to be untechnological. This is just to remind you that when you walked into a medieval or early modern parish church, you were confronted with the Ten Commandments. That was what you were confronted with. You were taught to be a good person, the presumption in Christian theology, of course, being that human nature is sinful, so human beings need to be taught how to treat each other well, and indeed there's a certain scheme of reward and punishment also that might encourage or discourage you, be a motive in psychological terms. And of course, by the 19th century, Buddhism had introduced seriously into the West, had been introduced seriously into the West, and took on its own, one might say, Western forms in the 20th and 21st centuries, and was teaching compassion via practice, and was most notably by now is, mindfulness is so huge. So that's a little history, if you like, but I wanted to say here's this hinge point where Adam Smith posits that human nature is naturally sympathetic, and one can say that ever since then, psychologists, biologists, and neuroscientists have been working out the extent to which human beings are neurally wired for that, for example, and to what extent it can be taught. And pretty well, I'm not a scientist, but I think it's fair to say that all scientists say that it can be taught to some extent. Compassion, empathy, altruism. I want to talk next a little bit about art, and I want to talk about it because the word empathy is a latecomer to this whole conversation. It didn't come into the English language until the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it came into British English as opposed to American English. It came into British English via the field of aesthetics through a woman called Violet Paget, who wrote under the name Vernon Lee, who's having something of a revival at the moment. A lot of people write about Vernon Lee these days. And she was interested in a series of questions about people's relationship to art. Does the viewing of art have a moral component? Here's how she's a creature of her time. How do we respond to art, especially the visual arts? Is it primarily through the body or the mind? And that was a question that was really being debated amongst psychologists, especially German psychologists at the time. And to answer her questions, she adopted the German term Einfühlung, empathy, which means to project yourself into. And she did this series of what she called experiments in art galleries. She and a friend, for a decade, she lived in Florence actually, went around all the art galleries in Rome and Florence, and they noted very carefully their response to art pieces. Did their muscles tense, their breathing change, their balance shift? What emotional feelings did they have when they saw certain pieces of art? Did they feel pleasant, harmonious, constrained, uncomfortable? What happened if they hummed in front of the art? Did the weather make a difference to their response? So she was acutely aware, and she wrote this book of essays called Beauty and Ugliness. She wrote, "My aesthetics will always be those of the gallery and the studio, not of the laboratory. They will never achieve scientific certainty. They will be based on observation rather than experiment, and they will remain for that reason conjectural and suggestive." But I think you can see what they were trying to do, Lee and her friends, and their observations were very close actually to the experiments done by psychologists like William James at the time at Harvard. He was trying to think through the relationship between bodily changes and emotional states. Why does the hair rise on the back of your neck? So although she underplayed what she was doing, there was a way in which she was in tune with the times. And in fact, her gallery observations really related to the kinds of questions that scientists carried on asking for the rest of the 20th century. So for example, she talked about the ways in which we mirror we mirror by our gestures. You know, if a sculpture is like that, we find ourselves going like that. And now psychologists, of course, talk about mirror neurons, and biologists. So I think what I want to ask is, here are two ways, and I've only able in this, because I've got 1 minute left, only able to gesture towards them, that compassion, empathy, are cultivated, they're taught, right? Religion clearly is one traditional one. the arts, whether it be a novel or the visual arts, is another. And so how does that help us think what it is we have to do to program a robot? Is any of this in any way relevant? And if we have a kind of cognitive as well as an affective empathy, how do you put what the psychologists call motifs into that programming, or what I, in theological language, would call grace? What makes us act, in fact? What makes us act on encountering the other in terms of the interests of the other rather than ourselves? Is it possible to put that into artificial intelligence? Thank you.
So I'm Alistair. I am a partner in an advertising agency based in San Francisco called Essence. I'd like to thank John Gillis, who's the reason why I'm here today. John is a family friend, and I rather fear that he mistook a couple of vaguely interesting dinner conversation topics with an ability to speak about this for 10 minutes. I'll do my best. As mentioned as well, I do have a background in philosophy, so I think what you'll see here is hopefully elements of kind of both of those backgrounds coming through. So I want to talk to you today about compassionate robots in advertising, briefly. I'm going to talk about why compassion is a very important concept in advertising. I'm going to talk about why, due to the complexities we face in digital advertising, we now have to rely on robots to be compassionate for us, in a sense. And I'm also going to talk about the problems that we can face as a result of that reliance. So a lot of you probably wouldn't be surprised if this slide stayed blank. Actually, compassion is a very important concept in advertising. And that's, of course, very different to saying that advertising is compassionate or that advertisers are compassionate. And I guess that's kind of the first of my philosophical points. Motivation, as we've heard today, is a very important concept in compassion. And we've heard about compassion needs to be an awareness of somebody's need state or suffering and a kind of attempt to alleviate that suffering. And that does happen in advertising, but you could certainly argue that the motivation is commercial. I mean, just the same, and Monica pointed out very well earlier today, that in business, treating people with compassion improves performance. You know, it can lead to more innovation. It can improve staff retention. You could equally argue that if somebody behaves compassionately, knowing those benefits, is that really compassion? And so I think a fair challenge, not one I'm going to immediately answer today. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will keep continuing referring to compassion in this context, but subject to that caveat. So advertisers often talk about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So this is really, you know, as I mentioned, a central concept. We need to imagine, like, how does somebody in this context feel? What are their needs? How can this product or service meet those needs, either in a rational sense through the kind of the benefits and features it has, or in a kind of ideal sense? So what are this person's ideals, and how can we align the ideals of this brand with that person? So as an example of this, harking back to 2004, a group of advertisers, this was not my firm, I should say, it's from someone called Daryl Fielding, who was a very inspirational teacher to me in my early years. So she, at the time, was working at Ogilvy. They realized that there was a large group of people who felt very, very alienated by an unrealistic portrayal of beauty in mass media. And it was this idea that led to the Dove Real Beauty campaign, which I guess a lot of you are very familiar with. And I think this is a very good example of at least an advertiser behaving compassionately. Again, just to briefly come back to that philosophical point, certainly if you ask Daryl what she is excited about and what motivated her and what she is proud of for this campaign is the fact that she helped women feel better about themselves. You could equally argue that she would not have been able to do it were it not commercially successful, which it was. You could also point out that Unilever, the company that ultimately bankrolled this, is the same company that bankrolls advertising for Axe deodorant or Lynx deodorant for the Europeans in the group, which is, of course, very, very different. So anyway, compassion is very important in this context of coming up with a message, an advertising message. It's also very important when we consider the context in which people are going to view that message. So for a TV advertiser, that's relatively easy. So of course people watching a TV ad are doing so in many, many different contexts, and there are many, many different individuals. But a TV advertiser doesn't have the visibility or capability to speak to those people differently. In digital advertising, especially on mobile advertising, we do. So we know about the very specific set of individual circumstances in which a mobile advertising impression, as it's called, that's one instance of an ad appearing, is occurring. And we also know quite a lot about the person that we're showing it to, or at least the device that we're showing it through. So we don't know someone's name, but we do know what sites they've looked at. We can take a pretty good guess at their age and occupation. And we really know quite a lot now about the context. So we at least know the location, and we know the time of day. And from that, we can infer, any number of different contextual factors, like what the weather is like there, what the pollen count is if I'm a hay fever advertiser, for example. So, of course, it's not actually possible for a human to put themselves in all of those shoes, so to speak. We may well, over the course of a moderately sized advertising campaign, have hundreds of millions of these impressions, and we will have literally milliseconds in which to decide, do we want to speak to this person at all, or, and what should we say to this person? And that's where really we rely on robots to, if you like, be compassionate, to try and understand what the need state of this person is. As an example of that, so this was a campaign which we ran for Google, who are one of our largest clients. And this is an ad which was able to say, so for example, you're in Seattle, you're in a very specific place in Seattle, it's 54 degrees and only slightly cloudy, which is pretty good for Seattle. So here's a sandwich bar nearby, we know it's lunchtime, here's a park where you can go and eat that sandwich. In this case, it's taking a pretty good guess that your need state is hunger, it's helping you to meet those needs, and it learns as well, so it will learn which messages people respond to in which contexts. It can see, do these people, in this case I should say, this ad is for the Google app, the Google search app. It's not the app itself, but it does recreate many of the benefits of the app itself in the ad, which is one of the reasons why it was compelling and it worked well. So again, just an example of a robot which is guessing at somebody's need state, attempting to meet those needs. It's worth saying that this does not always work very well. So I think we've all experienced instances of ads which seem to kind of follow us around the internet, which are kind of, we've added a pair of shoes to our digital shopping basket which we didn't buy, and that same pair of shoes chases us around. I've once seen, an ad for knives next to an ad about, not an ad, an article about knife crime in London. So in that context, the robot there is deliberately matching that ad because it thinks that content is relevant. So again, it's an example of how it can go wrong. We've already heard today about the uncanny valley, so I'm not going to talk about this again, but other than to say that this does apply also to the instance of robot-created advertising. So in just the same way that, we quite like humanoid robots, but we hate it when they get a bit too indistinguishable or not quite right. The same thing applies with advertising. So, a totally irrelevant ad has absolutely no interest to us whatsoever. An ad which is broadly targeted, but not in a disturbing way. So I'm reading Auto Trader. This is an ad for car insurance. Fine, that seems quite relevant. An inappropriately targeted ad, so it's clear here the advertiser knows who I am and what the situation I'm in, but they're getting that completely wrong, has a really negative effect. So what we need to do is try and get over that uncanny valley. And I think that actually it's compassion that can maybe get us over the uncanny valley. Back to Professor Timothy O'Shea's points, I think that it's not actually possible for robots to be compassionate. I think compassion requires co-feeling, it requires empathy, which really, I think, with my philosopher's hat on, requires consciousness. But I do think that compassionate behavior by robots can be a solution in advertising. Thanks.
So I'll just introduce myself by saying that epistemics is actually a synonym for cognitive science. So if you know what cognitive science is, you're home clear. So my thesis today is that robotic care is an oxymoron, which means it's a contradiction in terms. So that means that my main hypothesis is that compassion requires a lot from AI, and it will take more than 5 years to get there. I won't give you any more specific guess than that. But I'll suggest that in the interim, there is something valuable that AI can do for human compassion. So let me start by sketching a kind of very common scenario. That's a robot on the left, and that's a human on the right. It's actually a service robot which we developed in a project collaborative with the Technical University of Munich. So it's not actually a robot carer. But the common scenario, and we've touched on it earlier on, is you have a carer in a hospital or in a home looking after either a patient or perhaps an elderly person who needs help with cognitive or physical problems. And the goal of a robot in that context is to act compassionate. So it has to perceive people's physical or emotional states, it has to process them, it has to project appropriate reactions, and Sir Tim was adverting to that exactly, and it has to act. So in Anne Birgitta's terms, it has to notice, co-feel, and act. And just to emphasize, it has to be able to perceive emotions and project emotions, but it doesn't have to have emotions. It just has to be able to perceive and project. So, there are risks, even in that simple scenario, there are risks. And this is Paro, which Sir Tim was talking about and came up earlier on as well. So, there are risks which Amanda and Noel Sharkey have pointed to, which are that perhaps if we have robots in the home or in the care home, perhaps they get human beings off the hook. So you have somebody, they have their own robot pet, they have a nice time with their pet. That means that the people who should be caring for them aren't there anymore because they don't think they need to be. So there is a risk that robots may actually increase social isolation rather than reducing it. The other side of that, though, is that what do people talk about a lot? They talk about pets. So actually pets can be a pretext for human-human interaction. They may actually reduce social isolation. So I think the jury is out on that topic. But my worry is a deeper one. So the crucial thing is robots just don't care. That's the problem. So we criticize humans if they just act compassionate. We say they don't care. They just act as if they do. They are, in fact, just robots, if this is the way they enact compassion. And that's in the popular sense that they're going through the motions without feeling. As Monica observed, Weber gave us the idea of being a cog in the machine. And that's one reason why robot carer is a contradiction in terms for most people. And that's why medics need John Gillies' poetry book. If doing the right thing isn't enough for human beings, how could it possibly be the right thing for AIs? So, there is a further hazard which is associated with this, which is already looming for designers of artificially intelligent systems. We know that the artificial agents don't care. Is it ever ethical to let people think that they do? And this relates to something I've been thinking about quite a bit. This is not a robot of mine, but colleagues in Heriot-Watt University have been working with this particular platform. And you'll notice it's deliberately not very human, so there's no uncanny valley there. But something I've been thinking about is imbuing agents with personality. So responding to human events or communications with style and character. And I've been convinced by Joanna Bryson at Bath University that playing up social presence, which is something that we tend to do because we can, it's technically feasible, but it risks implying not just social agency, but actually also moral agency. And that's wrong because current robots are just tools. They are not responsible for their actions, their designers are. So perhaps we shouldn't be playing up personality and social presence, but disabusing people of the social nature of something like the IBO, which came up earlier on, is actually harder than you think, research has shown. So, as an aside, I might just mention that computer agents, when people know they're computer agents, may need to super signal in some ways for people to treat them as full social presences. So perhaps we do have a bit of room for maneuver there. So, the core problem for me is that for compassion, AIs need to be full moral agents. And now I'd like you to think about children, and I'll lead you to children in just a moment or two. To perceive and attribute compassion, we depend on a fundamental recognition of the joint humanity of the carer and the caree. And taking that further, I'd like to draw on some thoughts of my colleague Henry Thompson, who points out that in the literal sense, that kind of commonality can never include both, quotes, protoplasmic and mechanical intelligences, unquotes. But can we imagine any other basis for compassion between humans and machines? Here's a suggestion. We require co-participation in a range of social contexts. And that has to happen in a way which already presupposes at least incipient moral agency. Without that, no robust basis for compassionate behavior can be imagined. True, we allow children such co-participation as part of their acculturation process, as a means of imbuing them with a moral sensibility. So that notion of cultivation that we've been talking about, that James was talking about just now, is critical. But that's precisely because we have the most personal possible evidence that they're capable of moral agency. We know that we were once like them and we managed it. So the problem is this: what evidence would it take us to convince us that constructed artifacts, that robots, should be allowed that opportunity? Now, some of you will recognize that this is Kismet, Cynthia Brazil's robot, and the cognitive robotics movement, if you like, recognizes the importance of at least physical plausibility as a precondition for the acceptance of artifacts into the social context, and also the importance of such acceptance for the development of robust cognitive and perhaps moral competence. So Kismet was designed in a brilliant way to evoke caring and nurturing behaviors from human beings so that Kismet could learn. And to go back to something we talked about earlier on, and I think to go back to artificial compassion, it's not impossible to build emotion analogues. And Kismet has such emotion analogues, and that's how it works. In a sense, any future machine has got to be able to feel your pain before they can solve it. And I think that does raise the issue: do we want to build machines that actually suffer? And I think the answer is, you can't get very far unless you do. And so there's another design decision that we need to consider. And I think that's what's required to underpin artificial compassion. So we can build certain capacities necessary for compassion into systems, but I'd say that they're not sufficient. The reflective capacities for moral sensibility and agency remain distant. And in a nutshell, full moral agency requires what John Searle termed strong artificial intelligence, strong AI. Machines that have compassion require it, and it's not just enough to go through the motions and look as if you've got it. There's a further wrinkle. On top of that, these robots need to be accepted into our communities. If they're going to be enculturated, they need to be in our communities. And both of those are an uphill struggle. And they're some way off, I think, in both the technical environment, but also the political climate. Because AIs are the new other. And will they be accepted into our society in a natural and loving and embracing way? I think the jury is out in the current political climate. So that's my first and my main point. But I have a kind of constellation, and it's a shorter point. I think current AI can help compassion a lot, and it relates to Jane's discussion about teaching and cultivating compassion. So there's a direct route linking compassion and artificial intelligence. Even a weak artificial intelligence, one that can detect and process and respond to emotions, could teach compassion to human beings. We already see intelligent tutoring systems with very minimal artificial intelligence being used to help individuals with social skills deficits train how to deal better with other people. So in work on children with autistic spectrum disorder, there's a lot of work on that kind of use of AIs for training purposes. So such a system encodes best practice based on human experience without having had those experiences itself. Furthermore, intelligent tutoring systems like Effective AutoTutor have been given experimental affect recognition systems to help guide their interventions. So if you put those elements together, even machines without true compassion could help teach people about compassion. So we should definitely develop an intelligent tutoring system that explores scenarios, advises, and makes human carers think harder and feel harder. It would be, after all, an interactive compilation of human experience. And just like the hugely successful systems that Sir Tim was referring to, like IBM's Deep Blue and Watson and Google DeepMind's AlphaGo, we have an opportunity. So I put it to you, deep compassion. Thank you.
Very good. That was brilliant. Very, very good.
Wow, what an amazing discussion. So I just actually wanted to present a couple things to our panelists and ask a question or two and sort of get a response. and you mentioned some of these computing systems. We recently saw how a Google car was in an accident recently. And it made a deliberation that it didn't want to, I think, hit something. There was a bus to its left, and it thought that the bus would stop, so it pulled out and then got hit by the bus. So my question to you is, as they program these things, as they become more intelligent, if you will, let me give you the example of how would you see this working, where let's say you own one of these cars. The car has been programmed. Now we have the scenario where there's going to be an accident that's going to cost somebody their life. And if it goes straight, as an example, it will kill the occupants. If it turns to the left, it kills 100 people in a bus. How does that get programmed? Obviously, we've heard this moral dilemma before, but if you own the car, do you want it programmed to do this? And we also know, frankly, that on an intellectual, idealistic level, compassion's a wonderful thing. On a practical level, we see it distorted for personal gain, or the lack of compassion, if you will, or as humans, we have our own cognitive biases. So, Sir Tim, I'll start with you, and if you could just, I don't mean to put you on the spot at all.
You have put me on the spot. That's an immensely difficult question, but I don't actually think it's got anything to do with robotics or artificial intelligence. I think it's, there is a fundamental question, when you try to apply utilitarian metrics to things that relate to people's lives or people's conditions, and would you, 100 people who have got a week left to live versus a baby, which one do you program the car to go in? Well, that is a fundamental philosophical debate, and I don't think it actually relates to the question, the robotic question in hand at all.
Well, that's interesting, because I would think, as an example, if we have artificial intelligence, as an example, looking at utilization of resources and giving us information and giving us theoretically intelligent information on how best to proceed as a species, that these issues, though, ultimately come up, because whether it's resource utilization that will make a decision of who will best benefit from those resources or not. And in fact, this is the discussion, I think, of effective altruism. And then, of course, the question is, when we choose effective altruism, which is a very popular terminology here in the Valley especially, you don't hear the person who has all the money saying, I want to get a group of unbiased people together to determine the best distribution of these funds. It's, I'm the decider of what's the most utilitarian. But I understand your point. What are your thoughts?
I think it's very interesting, of course. And as you mentioned, harking back to my philosophy undergrad days, those are the kind of thought experiments that would be posed in like an ethics class, and you'd have a lot of time to deliberate them and think about them, or their choices which a driver makes in a snap moment. And now there are decisions which very real committees of people at Google and other companies are deciding what the best outcome in those instances should be. So I think it's right in the sense that it's a deferred responsibility. So it's ultimately the AI is following rules which are set by humans. But the law of large numbers dictates, I think, that some of these situations are going to come to pass. So it changes what was, formerly a kind of theoretical, interesting philosophical thought experiment, or a kind of snap decision into a very real kind of problem. I think the other interesting implication, is recently, as we've seen, there's been legislation to say that it is the manufacturers of the cars who have legal responsibility. Of course, legal responsibility is not entirely the same as moral responsibility, but I think it would be an interesting situation where you could have, on receipt of your self-driving car, you effectively have to answer questions about how you would like the car to behave in certain situations. And could be could be a route around it. Yeah.
Jane?
Well, I think this is really a great example of kind of the culture shift we grapple with constantly at Stanford, because here we are, this university in the middle of Silicon Valley, where science does extraordinary things, and sometimes we in the humanities feel beleaguered and we wonder why students aren't doing more humanities subjects, and the students feel they ought to do CS 106, which is the coding course they all do, even if they hate it. But the problem you've just set, really, Jim, is the exact reason why we need to marry the sciences and the humanities. So I think it's just a reminder that and all of this whole, everything we've talked about this afternoon is a reminder that we all do belong in the same room for these conversations. It's really essential that we're in the same room for these conversations.
Yeah, I would just echo that, if I may. The Research Council in the UK that funds engineering and physical sciences actually 2 or 3 or 4 years ago now actually realized this was a looming issue around robotics, and they did something very enlightened, which they got a multidisciplinary group together to discuss these issues. And the crucial point is this: it's not about ethics for robots, it's about ethics for roboticists and the kinds of systems we design now. Thank you.
Yes.
The kinds of systems we design now are our responsibility, and so that car, what it does, is a roboticist's responsibility. Okay.
Well, what an interesting, wonderful discussion, and I thank our panelists for really exploring with us some of the intriguing questions that need to be answered in the future, whether short-term or long-term. It's interesting, John, you said you didn't think this would be solved in 5 years, but many people didn't think Go would be solved in that period of time.
I was alluding to that, yes.
Yeah, so who knows? But really, what a wonderful discussion, as all the discussions were. I would like to thank our panelists, and I would like to thank each of you, and I would like to invite Liz back up to say a few words, and then we will close the session.
Thank you. Bring this down again. That was a wonderful set of ideas, thoughts, challenges to each of us, and a real message that interdisciplinarity and listening, as Jane said, in fact all the panel members and all the panel said, we've got to listen to each other. We've got to set the space aside to hear where we go next, or we're going to really distort the world that we live in by creating singular answers to questions that are complex and have multiple questions underneath them. I was intrigued by so much, because what we found here was just this resonance of different ideas, and yet coming down to quite simple issues. The fact that we share a humanity together, the fact that robots, the fact that we need to think about robotic care, even if it is an oxymoron, because we're in a world where aging, in a world where our multimorbidity and our non-communicable disease problem is so vast that we don't have the health worker capacity. We don't have the mechanisms to manage the care that's needed for everybody. And I say this very personally because my particular area of interest is in end-of-life care, as the principal alluded to, and just ensuring that across the globe people have the right to the care that they need before they die. But as we think about robotic care, and you mentioned that robots are not necessarily caring unless it's, or not necessarily compassionate unless it's artificial compassion, but what they are doing is creating allowing us to be cared for, creating the space for all of us to have a compassion, to accept some sort of compassion, to be compassionate towards ourselves. The one word that came up, and it was from yourself, Jane, just towards the end, was that grace is important. And I think in all our interactions today, we've heard just a little echo, a little background, that grace, the graciousness to be together, the grace that allows us as humanity to live together, and the grace that takes us forward is important. It's important in the co-compassion that we heard, the sense of can we work together to give something back and create mechanisms that solve some of the challenges that are here today and in the world that we face. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the support for CCARE here and for the Edinburgh Compassion Initiative and the opportunity together to go forward, not to leave just these conversations and ideas here, but to actually take them. And we would love to have your thoughts, your ideas, your vision of where we take each of these things forward. I'm going to hand to Jim.
Thank you, Liz. It's really wonderful that we are developing this partnership with the University of Edinburgh and with other universities to really, I think, bring this message of the importance of compassion to our humanity and really what I believe defines our species. But the extraordinary thing, and I think the purpose of our discussions, especially this last panel, is to have us understand how technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, the highest ideal is to make them improve our lives and to make us all have a sense that, in fact, we are all cared for. There's not an inequality, but in fact, an equality. I would like to thank all those who helped plan this, my team at CCARE, my colleagues from the University of Edinburgh. We have a few gifts for our participants, and I would like to invite you all to a reception after this. You're all welcome to attend, and thank you so much for being with us today.